start recording and then we can get started. There we go. Well, thank you all for attending. This should be a really interesting topic of discussion. It's something that Madi and I have been discussing between us for a little while now, and we knew we really wanted to have a session on this because it's really important. And Joseph and Adrian, we came across your work on it, and we just knew instantly we had to have you for this discussion. So thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, are you each happy introducing yourselves? Madi, should we start with you maybe?
Yeah. Well, my name's Madi. I'm an RN from Seattle, Washington, and I'm currently the executive director at Insight. And so my executive duties at Insight are pretty straightforward because we don't do too much as an organization, but a lot of what we do is kind of expand and sort of reach out into academia and into other sectors to see what new concepts we can apply to the humanitarian sector, because it's a very diverse sector, it's a very fluid sector. And I think it's important for us to really be aware of other ideas that are circulating out there that would really benefit humanitarians and all of the people who then benefit from our care. And so that's sort of how this topic came up, is that one of my nursing instructors had introduced me to the concept of moral injury for emergency department nurses. And I was like, wow, that is absolutely something that I can relate to in the sector. And so it's sort of been, it's cool to get to bring something that I'm really interested about from other parts of my life into the work that we do at Insight, because nursing and executive duties don't always overlap. But that's kind of a bit on my background with this topic, as well as my background as a professional.
Thank you. Joe, could you introduce yourself next, please?
Sure. My name is Joe Winkka-Lydon, and I'm actually, right now, I am a researcher and lecturer at Wake Forest University in North Carolina in the United States. And my training is actually in religious ethics and moral philosophy at the moment. As you can see from this space, I'm in an engineering department, actually helping them with trying out new ways to do ethics in engineering. It's part of a larger program here at Wake Forest, which that's a whole other separate thing. But my research and some of my teaching has been in religion, conflict, peace building, and especially looking at moral injury and trauma, and especially and looking in situations like wars and genocides such as that in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the 1990s, how war doesn't just affect people economically, it doesn't just affect them culturally, or even just psychologically, it affects them in a deeply moral way. They can actually interfere in the way in which people feel that they're able to be a certain person and hope for certain futures, and whether they think they can be good. So that's kind of my overview. Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. And over to you, Adrian.
Hi, everyone. I'm Adrian Bravo. My training is in experimental psychology, so my PhD is geared in that domain, but most of my research really focuses on addictions and substance use among numerous populations, including young adults cross-culturally in different countries, but also with military veterans. So my work within moral injury really has focused primarily within veterans. Currently, we have a National Institute of Health intervention grant to develop a mindfulness-based intervention targeted moral injury among combat wounded veterans. On a personal note, I am a political refugee, immigrated to the States when I was young, and so I've dealt with some of that process and have many friends who are undocumented, so I've heard and related to them. More recently, I've reviewed various articles that have applied moral injury towards humanitarian crises, particularly refugee camps and various aspects of the world.
Thank you. And just quickly introduce myself. As you can see, my name's Daniel. I'm the Director of Outreach with Insight Collaborative. I'm here as host today. I have no particular expertise in moral injury, although, as Madi says, it's very prevalent in the in kind of international development, and I've absolutely witnessed instances of it myself. And I also have a personal interest in philosophy and ethics, so I'm really interested to see what you all have to say. So we'll be structuring this around a series of questions for our expert panelists. But if anyone in the chat would like to ask any questions, please do. You can ask it either in the chat box or in the Q&A. And I will endeavour to relay those questions to our panelists when it's a kind of appropriate break in the conversation. But to begin with, I'll start with our most basic question, which is probably also the broadest, which is very simply, what is moral injury? Because in some ways, it's not an easy topic to get your head around, or at least it can be difficult in some ways to define. So I'd love to hear from all of you on how you would define moral injury. Would you like to start us off, Joe?
Sure. Yeah, and like you said, it's a fluid definition, and there's still a lot of argument about it. So I think we could talk all hour just about this one question. One helpful way to define it is define it up against not just trauma, but post-traumatic stress disorder, which had been, I think it was codified like around 1980 in psychology and psychiatry. And had really been, especially when you look at veterans, when you're thinking of like psychological harms, PTSD was really a central diagnosis. About 10 years after that, a psychiatrist who was working with veterans, US veterans from the wars in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, argued that trauma and PTSD specifically doesn't quite get at everything that happens to somebody in a situation like that. And came up with the idea of moral injury. So it comes out of a specific context, US veterans in a specific war. And it's kind of also a bit of a critique. It kind of pushes back against PTSD, not to say that there is no PTSD, but to kind of make some room, because what this psychiatrist and then others after him saw with the veterans is that once they're treated for PTSD, there are still these feelings of what he described as shame, guilt, and despair around what they'd done, what they'd seen, maybe what they'd failed to do, what they'd failed to stop. That, to kind of put it in another language, made them feel like people that weren't good anymore. Right, that's kind of like a broad. We can talk about that, but kind of it didn't just impact their day-to-day functionality. It impacted the way they saw the world, how they saw themselves, how they saw others, and whether they actually thought that they could, try to be a good person, or even if they were worthy of trying to be a good person, or even if the world was capable of being a place that could nurture goodness. And I'm using this word "good." You can kind of fill that in as you will, and we can talk too about that. But that's kind of like a brief overview as far as how it relates to some other ideas in psychology and philosophy. And like trauma itself, it's now expanding beyond that one episode of that one context, because people in other contexts are saying, oh, we've seen things too that we don't have a language for, we don't have this term for. And so now we're in this very, very dynamic space where, like we are today, where people are using this term and saying it's getting at something that happens to people who experience violence that isn't completely comprehended by the language of trauma, as important as trauma is. There's something that's elided with that language that moral injury brings in.
Thank you, Joe. That's really interesting and really good to get a bit of that background on where the concept comes from. Adrian, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think Joe gave a great overview of what is kind of how people have kind of theorized and conceptualized what moral injury may be. And I'm kind of just going to elaborate further with what Joe touched upon. Particularly, it really did originate from this military line of research, particularly in more recent literature when trying to conceptualize it. They've really broken it down into two different parts. One are experiences that may cause those symptoms like guilt, shame that Joe discussed. And these experiences really put us in a place that we have to critique or question our moral code, our ethics, our beliefs about the world around us. And particularly tied to military combat, you're taught and told to do things that would counter anyone's moral teachings and things like that. Like, don't harm children or don't abuse them. But what happens when you're in a combat zone and there's a child soldier trying to shoot you? It puts people in these moral conflicts. And for many of them, they can kind of overcome it. They can rationalize it some way, but for a lot, they can't. And it kind of leads to these moral emotions, which Joe kind of talked about, this guilt, shame, and issues that might relate to that. And again, what Joe touched about, it doesn't just have to be you acting out these things. It could be some witnessing some of these events and so forth. And more recently, the literature, like Joe has said, has expanded into many different areas and domains. Case in point, looking at COVID-19 and how it's impacted hospital workers like Madi and other individuals who are at front lines of these really strong conflict issues that they have to decide upon. And it could really have them question themselves and their world around them. And in our research, and touching upon what Joe said with its relationship to trauma, particularly PTSD, most and how we have conceptualized it differently than PTSD is that with PTSD, a lot of it's fear-based. That's really creating this harm around individuals, and it's creating these intrusions and negative affects associated with PTSD. However, with moral injury, it's not always just fear-based that causes these things. It could be a lot betrayal from higher ups in your organization, or just simple things that seeing or witnessing things that you know is wrong, but you can't report on it because of the culture of where you grew up or living in, or in this case with humanitarian crisis, what's around you, the context has a big impact on that. And within our research, at least, it's shown that even above and beyond PTSD, it still presents a lot of mental health symptoms, particularly depression, anxiety, and even suicide ideation. So there's a lot of negative consequences that can come from it. And I think for the large part, and I agree with Joe, we've kind of just couched it as some form of trauma, but never really thought about it. Because when we're treating these veterans, at least for PTSD, we're getting at these core intrusions and things like that. But them still feeling guilty is not something that's usually encompassed when treating PTSD. And so this touches upon a different form of trauma, in this case, what we talked about, moral injury.
Thank you. And finally, Madi, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think that obviously those were some really good, I think understanding like the background and where moral injury came from is really important, because I think a lot of what makes discussing this topic so hard for people who've experienced any sort of moral injury is that like the very nature of it, like even, morality and ethics in of itself is a really fluid concept, and it varies from individuals and cultures and communities. And so talking about that, saying just moral injury and trying to tie a hard definition to it can be really difficult. And so I think having the context explained so well has been really important. And so I thank you both for opening with that. And in my experiences, where I decided to kind of start pulling it into the humanitarian sphere here is because the lens that the person who introduced me to the concept of moral injury used to sort of show it to me was what happens when we're put in these situations where we are forced to witness and then be powerless to, or to even perpetuate structural violence. And the only critique that I have of academia at the moment is that, and it's partly a time-based thing, it's not that what people are doing intentionally, but a lot of the focus of the research of moral injury has been on like traditional combat settings, or even, they call us frontline workers for a reason. We're in these contexts that are recognized as like intense, almost battlefields, but structural violence is something that we don't even have enough discussions about how that relates to a sector like humanitarianism and development. We don't talk about how colonialism and racism and these really, really violent and damaging and traumatic structures and systems are present in the sector that we work in. And so I've been really relying heavily on moral injury as a concept to sort of help show people what types of emotional responses you can have as someone who's coming in to intervene. Especially humanitarianism is a paradox where like we're on one end like glamorized and we're called heroes, and people say like, oh my goodness, your work, it's kind of similar for nurses and healthcare workers too, like you're saving the day. But we know at a practical level, when we come into these situations, we know that that could not be any farther from the truth. And that then damages our morality when we come in thinking that we're going to see one thing and do one thing, and we find that the exact opposite is true. And so that's kind of how I've dragged it into this conversation, is saying like, how can we use this as a way to sort of examine the consequences of structural violence, not just on the people who are directly impacted by structural violence, but also on those of us who are having to intervene in situations where we're powerless against it, or we're even being used as like tools to perpetuate it.
Thank you. And it's a really interesting introduction from all three of you. So thank you so much for that. And it's actually got me wondering, well, no, actually, maybe we should go into the next question. I think the next question helps with kind of articulating the background of what we want to get at in this session, and then I'll move on to other questions later. So I'll move straight on to our next question for now, which is, how do humanitarian crisis contexts contribute to, or even directly cause, moral injury? So we've kind of talked a little bit about what it is, but it'd be really helpful to look at look at it in a humanitarian context and how the humanitarian context can cause moral injury, and that can be for anyone involved. That can be for people caught up in it in a professional sense or a personal sense, or even people witnessing it from a distance but still relatively closely. Adrian, could we start with you this time?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I think there's a lot of context that could be applicable where people could face these, particularly these moral conflictions that they have to deal with on a daily basis. Not even, and me here, I'll focus on those individuals who are impacted with regards to refugees and so forth. There's a lot of research looking into those individuals and how they're struggling with being displaced, being put in the camps and things like that. And unfortunately, when we're talking about moral ethics and dilemmas, for especially those who are parents of children who are with them and so forth, how do you provide for them? And especially when we're talking about migrant issues and moving forward and having to trust other people who you have no affiliation with, placing that trust with them and knowing that they could lead to bad things, is that providing for your children or not? So these daily questions about what's right, what's wrong. If I know that this will help me achieve a better status or well-being within this community, yet I know it's not, it might go counter to my religious beliefs or moral beliefs, how do you weigh those decisions and so forth? And again, in thinking about the context they're trying to get out of these refugee camps and so forth, to what end are you willing to do that? And those are not easy questions for anyone to deal with, but particularly if they have strong beliefs about the world and so forth. When do you have to counter them? Is it worth it? Is it not? And this would naturally lead to a lot of strong emotions for these individuals. Tied to that as well, research has looked at professionals, those who are in those camps are aiding and trying to assist as many ways as possible. They are also making tough decisions of who can be next in line, who's getting incorporated, who's going to be helped out first. And all of these people need help all at the same time. But, and as Madi can allude, in the hospital setting, these decisions are made on the fly really quick. And you still have time to grasp that until it's too late or after work or things like that. So these professionals who are trying to help these individuals are dealing with dilemmas themselves about how the world should be functioning and so forth. And for these migrants themselves, these daily questions about what's next, not knowing the future, not knowing what's coming next, how long will this last and so forth, really test who you are. And not saying that there is a right or wrong answer to what they're doing, but these are naturally events that would cause anyone to have to really evaluate who they are and what their beliefs are about the world. And naturally, this could lead to many moral emotions, particularly guilt, shame, anger, all of these natural kind of symptoms or kind of emotions that we all have. But imagine it being culminated with stress and all these other issues that they're dealing with in the environment that they're in. It would naturally lead to more mental health struggles and issues that they may be dealing with.
Thank you. I wonder if I could ask you just to elaborate a little bit there, Adrian, because you say, I think very correctly, that being in these kind of situations can really cause you to feel guilt and shame and maybe a degree of moral inadequacy in some ways. And yet, from the way that you were defining it earlier, all three of you, moral injury isn't the same as shame or that feeling of moral inadequacy or guilt, because those are, I suppose, almost natural human responses to certain situations. Maybe there are natural things, we all feel guilt or shame at some point in our lives. So if that is the case, then I guess how would you define the difference between them?
Yeah, so it's a good point. So I think one of the key things, it's really the culmination of all these factors and not being able to adequately deal with them. So I think and this applies to any kind of mental health symptoms and things like that. Early on, when you're feeling these guilt, this shame, this anger and all that, if you don't deal with it in an adequate way via appropriate coping responses or religion or prayer or whatever it might be, it kind of just permeates there within the individual. And over time, without dealing with it, it could lead them to, particularly with depression and suicide ideation and so forth, because their perception of who they are is shattered because of what decisions they have made or have witnessed. And even events that even out of their control. But I mean, thinking of migrant caravans, and I've had undocumented friends discuss this with me on a personal note and talk about the amount of violence, sexual assault, things that they feel helpless to do, but they still feel some guilt because I should have intervened, I should have done these things. And so with these core more emotions, which again are natural to all of us, but a culmination of them, and particularly not being able to address them in whatever appropriate way might be for that individual, kind of leads them and festers to more problematic issues. And unfortunately, it could be leading to how do you cope with it in a negative way, substance use or other maladaptive ways to deal with it.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Madi, would you like to go next?
Yeah, of course. I think Adrian's raised a really interesting point about some of the things that migrants and refugees and displaced people experience. You know, obviously along this migratory pathway, a lot of us in the humanitarian sector, especially those coming from more privileged backgrounds, like we can't even begin to relate to the series of decisions that people have had to make. And a lot of the work that I do focuses on men. One of our big projects at Insight Collaborative is the Brothers Campaign. And so, you know, even within the migrant population, we then have migrants who were members of gangs or who were members of the armed forces in whatever country or region they've come from. And so they, you know, we have sort of two big considerations at a practical level in the humanitarian sector when it comes to moral injury, at least in my experience and what I've seen, is that we're dealing with people who have experienced immense amounts of potentially morally injurious events. And similar to PTSD, you know, the way that this manifests, the severity with which it manifests in the individual and what can go on to cause like clinical symptoms of depression or anxiety. It'll vary depending on the individual and their coping and their perception. But I think anytime you experience an event like this at any point along that journey of migration, though, it significantly impacts you going forward. And so those of us who come from backgrounds where we were not put into positions where our morality was questioned, and then also our relationship with ourselves and our morality and our image was questioned, it's really hard for us to sympathize with that. Like when I was a beginning humanitarian, I wouldn't have understood what that journey and what that process would do to you. But now that I've intervened, one, at so many places along the migratory pathway, but also in so many situations where I experienced this problem of either having to say or do something or witness something and not be able to act, that intervened with my moral compass. I think we also have to take into consideration too the way that it impacts humanitarians as well. Those of us who are working in these settings, who come in, you know, knowing full well. I think one of the biggest things that I've heard in conversations lately in the sector is people saying, like, I understand that what I'm doing right now is not contributing to a sustainable solution. And that to us is very morally injurious, because we see that we're basically perpetuating an industrial complex that's contributing to these problems. But you're so stuck in the cycle that you would then violate an even higher moral code if you were to say, you know, I'm not going to feed you because the food coupon system is donor dependent and that perpetuates dependency, and I don't believe in doing that. Like we also have to consider ways where these are sort of enmeshed. It's not as simple as being like, I don't believe in killing someone, so I'm not going to do that. But there's other types of events or situations that you can be put in that really damage your morality, especially when you're able to see these systems for the complexities that they are. And so, I mean, my answer to that question will be, we kind of have to look at this from two fronts, where there's the morally injurious experiences that refugees and migrants encounter, both in the situations that cause them to become displaced, and then all along that journey, all along that pathway. And then, like, this is a whole other webinar topic in of itself, but then that when they're integrating, you know, having to abandon your culture and your identity, that can also cause really serious injuries to people's morality within the definition of moral injury. And then we also have to look at it from the humanitarian worker perspective of how does the humanitarian sector itself cause these types of injuries on the professionals who are here trying to help.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a really important point, that it affects essentially everybody involved in humanitarian contexts, really. I don't think there's any group of people who wouldn't be affected by moral injury in one kind of capacity or another. And finally, Joe, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate all the comments and careful thoughts. You know, one of the first definitions, you know, I come from this in a little bit removed, because I kind of do, you know, ethics and whatnot, and a lot of times that can be very high, sadly abstracted, when ethics is actually something incredibly personal and practical. But, you know, when it was first discussed and defined, it was actually defined as relationships, as a soldier relating to those who are the soldier's superior, right? And relationships where you have power over someone and there's trust involved. And that's one of the reasons why it was initially defined as a sense of betrayal, because you have that relationship. But I think one of the important things to take from that, especially when we're talking about humanitarian work, is the institutional context, right? Sometimes we can think of our ethics, our morality as our own, but I think anybody who's had a job feels how the way you've been raised or your expectations can come into conflict with the institutional reality of just living and being in institutions, and institutions themselves, these contexts, are transformative of ethics and morality. And I think that's this thing when we're talking about moral injury, a way for some people to, Madi, what you're saying about the difficulty of trying to understand this, we can think of just these basic experiences we have where we enter into places and feel things like moral distress. It's like we feel like something should be done one way, but you can't do it, right? Because of institutional obstacles, you don't have enough power, right? We've all had a little taste of that. It's not necessarily injurious, right? It's not something that's necessarily going to be this thing that haunts us or weighs on us, but we can feel that of this institutional life. And then so when you get to a situation like humanitarian situations, which are, and Madi, you brought this up, and I think it's really important, these situations where so much history of colonialism, of unjust structures, of power, of indifference are all coming down and intersecting in individual bodies. And I think humanitarians can kind of feel the weight of that isolation, right? Of trying to putting your body in to try to solve this. And then all of a sudden, you're not just in the midst of this crisis, you're in the midst of a history, right? And you're now intervening in the histories of other people who are in this coming to this place, and how incredibly overwhelming that can be, and the weight of that. And so I think if we look at it that way, it would be almost unthinkable that moral injury wouldn't result if someone really isn't given a lot of support. And I know this goes to the third question we're going to talk about, but not given the support for that to happen. So everybody in that situation, it's just this powerful cauldron of history, of injustice, right? And relationship with somebody trying to do good, and then feeling like, as everyone has said here, you're now become an instrument of, if not evil, then injustice. And so some of the work that I've done is, like looking at the soldier side of things. Soldiers are, they execute policy, right? Militarized foreign policy. They don't make it, but their bodies actually have to be the ones, the hands actually have to be the ones that do that policy. And so they have an intimacy, usually a burdened intimacy, with policy from policymakers who are never in that context and never have to see the results. Well, you can see that too, we're just focusing on the humanitarian workers themselves. It's very much the same thing. They're putting themselves in there and they're dealing with the repercussions of policy, of politics, of culture, and of history. And they gain an intimacy, a burdened intimacy that burdens them and can injure them. And so I think that this term, even though it started in the military context, you have this humanitarian context where you have those high stakes, right? Often wrapped up in war. And I think it's one, I'm glad to see that this is being taken on, because I think we can actually learn more about not just what people are going through in these situations, but also what it is to be human more generally.
Thank you, Joe. There's some really interesting points there, which I'd quite like to pick up on briefly, actually, before moving on to the next question. First is, I really liked your expression, that the way that history weighs on us, because obviously there's this quite well-known phrase of, standing on the shoulders of giants. And of course, that's very true. Each of us in our respective fields could not do the work we do without the work that was done by those who came before us in those fields. But you're absolutely right. It happens in a negative way as well. We are each of us weighed down by the structures that have been created, by the injustices that have been committed. And it is very hard to escape those. And I also really liked the analogy you made between the military and the humanitarian sector, insofar as you're saying soldiers as they interact with their superiors. And I think that's very much something that is true in the humanitarian sector as well. Now, obviously, the chain of command tends to be less rigid in the humanitarian sector than it does in the military. But nonetheless, I think everybody would have been in organizations where they are maybe not entirely comfortable with the ethical culture or with the ways of working or something like that, or where their own personal ethics are, they do run counter to the ethics of the organization. So yeah, I think that is very much applicable to the humanitarian sector as well.
Daniel, I just want to touch based on that first comment you made about history and the context and things like that. I mean, I think looking at particularly what's happening in the US right now with undocumented children being sent on their own across the border, and many people, especially Americans, are like, how could you leave your child like that? How can you do something like that? And then I want to tell them, I don't think you understand how bad it is they're coming from. That is in their mind and their view, the only solution possible. And you cannot imagine how painstaking that has to be for those parents who are giving up those choices or leaving on their own and leaving their family behind and coming on their own to provide for them in some capacity. And so I think one thing to illuminate this is the complexity behind such an important topic is that what we defined as what is morally right or wrong, it's that on each individual has their own decision about that. And also what is more important? Is it the taking care of their children? Is it the providing? So all of these things, there are so many layers to it. And that's the hard part behind just coming up with one definition, one way to treat it, one way to deal with it. Because as Joe and Madi said, a lot of it is personal and it has to be uniquely in that sense, because we can all debate what's right, wrong, all to the day, but ultimately to that individual, it is causing them some distress. And that is something that we need to tackle among all people, both the migrants themselves, but also the workers.
And that I think is like $1 million point that I have to bring up too, is like one of the most important questions that I learned to ask very early on in my career is why? And what's funny is that in mental health and in medicine and nursing, we're taught not to ask questions like that because it can open Pandora's box, right? But in my career, and I've been so blessed to be able to be like the director of my organization. So obviously within limits, I can just go do whatever I want. And that question of why has really led me to understand the complexities of the decisions that people are having to make. And so it's made me less judgmental in the ways that I'm interacting with people who have been put into morally injurious situations. And it's also sort of led me down the road of how I navigate mine, of understanding that every action that we make has a deeper meaning. And before we sort of pass judgment, and this then I think sort of ties into trauma, because what is traumatic as an aid worker is when, and I personally don't really like that term, but as a humanitarian is when I make a decision or we're in a certain situation and people pass judgment about the choices that we've made or the way that we've chosen to do something without understanding the full context. And that, especially with the current narrative about Palestine, I think mainstream is real. People are really starting to understand the trauma of just denial and a refusal to look at someone and listen to someone and sort of see what are they trying to say? What are they carrying? Who are they actually? That absolute disdain for the individual and their context can be really traumatic and cause trauma to us as individuals and as communities and societies, right? And so I think that point is really important in understanding, yes, all of the things that are morally injurious, it varies to all of us and our response to it varies greatly. But I think at the end of the day, if you sit down and have that conversation with someone and say how did this affect you? Or why did you make that decision? You will easily, I think more easily than people assume as well, quickly understand and see how and why someone has made a decision like that and why it actually really does make sense ethically and morally for them to do that.
And I just would like to add with that, I mean, that idea of recognition, of being able to just recognize someone and of not recognizing someone, that itself is an ethical act, right? When you don't recognize someone or don't spend the time to learn, you are you're ordering them in your priorities and their moral status. Somebody can very clearly feel their moral status go down. I think that probably also happens a lot. I have not done international humanitarian work. I did work with the Red Cross in the United States for a while. That also includes within humanitarian organizations. If the humanitarian's having a bad time and the organization itself disregards that, that's dangerous for moral injury. But it can set up a whole series of issues, especially if you're saying, but we're humanitarians and you're treating me awfully. Where's the care? Like there's so many complexities there, right? But it even gets down to the very basis of just, a team leader, a supervisor, just caring, and also just the difficulty in those situations of the capacity to have care can be very limited as well, right? So even situations like that, but that recognition is just so incredibly basic as just a moral moment, moral relation between somebody else, that a lot of things can be going well for somebody in every different way, but if they aren't recognized, if they aren't heard, that can be even worse than like a physical wound.
Absolutely. I actually think that the basic recognition of your needs and your humanity and your validity is among the most basic of psychological needs. If I can, if you can think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something, but think of it from a psychological perspective, then I would argue at least that recognition is maybe right at the very bottom, the very base of that pyramid, because it is so important. And I actually wonder if that is a small part of the moral injury and also the trauma in any country where someone belongs to a group of second-class citizens or even not citizens at all. So Madi, you brought up Palestine, so of course this would apply to Palestinians, but it would also apply to, for example, the Bedouin in Kuwait, or the Rohingya across much of Southeast Asia, anywhere really where a whole group of people are not recognized as valid citizens, even valid human beings in some cases. So I wonder also, our third question is, how do we address moral injury? And this is probably the million-dollar question. I imagine there's a lot of work still to be done on this. But from your perspective, how do we address moral injury in those experiencing and witnessing conflict or humanitarian disasters and forced displacement? Madi, would you like to start us off on this one?
I would love to start off on this one. I think in the recent months that I've sort of started these discussions, because the pandemic, I will say this, the pandemic has caused exponentially higher problems in this sector. The first group of people that are going to feel the impacts of a global event are those who are most marginalized and most vulnerable, undoubtedly. And so, especially as someone who tries to coordinate medical care off of scraps, basically before this pandemic, people's volunteered time, like donated time, donated supplies, we're really feeling the brute force of this pandemic. We were months ago, and it's just getting exponentially worse. And so we're being that causes us to be put into situations where we encounter morally injurious events with more frequency. And it's also reduced our own capacities to cope, because I think that while trauma and moral injury are different, I think that for either of those things, you need a certain level of your own capacity to be able to cope with them, to recognize them, or even the space to remove yourself from the situation that's causing it. And right now, a lot of us don't have that option. And I try to tell this to my colleagues, my medical colleagues even don't understand this in the same level as humanitarians, because I'm like, look, when you sign out at the hospital, you know that someone else is coming on shift. You give your report, you get to step away, you go rest. We don't get that right now. No one else is coming in to tag us in, and people are just falling away. And so it really started this fresh round of conversations for us in the sector of like, obviously everyone's mental health is terrible, and how do we approach that? And the trauma narrative, the secondary trauma narrative, is the one that really dominates the humanitarian sector, and it absolutely is a huge issue here. But similar to how moral injury came about when talking about combat veterans, people in the sector are starting to realize like trauma doesn't necessarily cover it, especially in this current situation where it's like slow burn trauma is how someone had described it to me. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of it, because you're just you're part of this system, you're a part of this context in this situation that's sort of wearing down at your morality every day and testing you in new ways every moment of every day. And so for us, at least in my circle, what's been most important is just introducing this concept and the vocabulary for people to start to use this to express themselves. Because for me, it's been really helpful to be able to say, like this incident was very traumatic, where I experienced, firsthand violence against myself, or I witnessed against someone else, and I was having symptoms of like post-traumatic stress. But I was able to work through it and utilize resources that are successful in healing people from traumatic events. And now, like, I'm doing better. But I think that the pathways and the avenues that we have to take for talking about morally injurious events and the experiences that we have of moral injury, and then sort of mapping a way out of that and of healing from that, it's a different path than we take for dealing with other events that we encounter in this profession and in our lives. And so I think the most important thing that we can do at this point is just really raising awareness about it. Continuing to, dig into academia. One of my biggest critiques of the humanitarian sector is that we're way too disconnected from academia. And people kind of say like, oh, practice versus theory, there's a gap. And like, in some ways there is, but I think at least in the research that I've read, like Adrian sent me some great articles. I was doing a lot of research about this myself before. This is one of the few areas that I've actually seen the research and the discussion in academia about moral injury being very on point with what we on the ground are actually experiencing. And so I think the more people who just know about this and know that it's a topic that they can explore is awesome. And then what I'm currently looking for, at least, as the head of an organization, I see it as my responsibility to bring these resources to the people that I work with. Finding practitioners who are really aware of moral injury. And I hope that that's something we can promote in the coming years, pulling those people into the sector and saying, what can we do to create healthier systems and institutions and organizations to support people through this process, to minimize the amounts of time that we're exposed to morally injurious events, and to help promote this discussion and this conversation. And, like Joe said, to make people just feel seen and validated in their experiences. That is what's most vital. So it's very simple stuff. I don't think it means that we have to bring in like expert psychologists or conduct our own research. I think this is one of the few areas where a lot of the information is out there already. We just need to sort of take it and make this vocabulary part of our everyday conversation and get people really familiar and comfortable with the topic.
Thanks, Maddie. That's really interesting. I'm also intrigued to note that you mentioned specifically kind of witnessing violence and things like that. For me personally, although obviously I have witnessed violence both against myself and against others in the humanitarian context, I've also felt there have been times when I have been torn between two awful responses to things, as in I've been torn between two different ways of responding morally to a given situation, and I haven't been happy with either of them. And for me, that, I guess for me personally, that has been the most morally injurious thing, more so than witnessing violence that I could not personally prevent, has been when I have had to do something and thought, I've never hated myself more than when I've done this thing, because this is not the right thing to do. It's just the least wrong thing that I can think of right now. And yeah, so for me personally, at least, that was by far the worst or the most morally injurious experience I've had in a humanitarian situation. Joe, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate everything you both said. And sometimes our values can haunt us, right? We think about, character and values and all these things as very positive things, and they certainly are. But almost in a way, the more personally responsible you feel, the more vulnerable you are to moral injury, in a way. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. But when you're talking about a situation like that, somebody who doesn't necessarily have that moral compass might not have been really flustered at all, right? But that's a situation where those things can continue to linger and haunt us, even after we're far away from the context where these values popped up, whether it's like, a class when we're a little kid, or we're, being with parents or loved ones. These things can almost surprisingly, because we don't think about them this way, they can surprisingly feel like they're sources of harm instead of sources of agency and ability. And I also agree with Madi. I think a big start is just vocabulary, right? We're not raised with vocabulary that speaks of devastation, especially in these ways. Trauma, I think, has helped a good deal with that. But moral injury is kind of getting at a dimension that doesn't necessarily quite capture. I think trauma sometimes, the way that you talk about it, it depends, but it speaks to a need for a broader vocabulary that people are using. Because if you can actually, if you think about in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, when there really wasn't a problem until feminists came up with the term sexual harassment. Then all of a sudden it was something you could name, you could think of, you could have a movement around, right? There could be policies around it. Then all of a sudden that even though that behavior might continue, it's a different world and you have more abilities, right? I think another piece of this is community. In some way, developing strong community in those contexts, which can be very difficult because these are contexts that, especially if they are political violence, rip community apart, right? So you're going into situations where that might be anti-communal in certain ways, where people feel wrenched from that, which speaks to the need, but also the difficulty to have some sort of sense of community and practices that ground people, where people do feel recognized, where they feel like so that even if there is these days where you feel like nothing good is coming from this, you're building something. At least you're building something with people. And then the worst comes to worst, that can be, think about it also in terms of networks. If somebody has access to people beyond their geographic location, if they can't have that community there, can there be other communities that they can interact with remotely, right? I think a big part of this with moral injury is there's a strong political dimension where people feel, when they say betrayed, it's sometimes they feel betrayed by their communities, their institutions, their countries, right? In a number of different things. And so doing something positive and generative to kind of counter that, to feel a part, to feel embedded. I think that can go a long way. In addition to, I know there's a lot of therapies being developed. I think therapeutic interventions are incredibly helpful. But I think beyond that, I think these things with language and community are very, very important.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that kind of sense of community is really important, and community reinforcement. And it kind of makes me wonder if there's a place for almost a pre-briefing on moral injury in professions which are prone to it, so that as a part of the training for humanitarians, for soldiers, for medical staff, and as a part of their briefing before they go out into this kind of situation, if there were to be a discussion of moral injury and the kind of things that people might face in that situation. And I wonder if that might be helpful.
And I would include in that resources with art and literature, because a big part of it is imaginal. And like a lot of work that's being done with veterans and others is using art. A lot of like veteran groups are reenacting Greek plays, which they're saying like, these are about war and moral injury and trauma, and having veterans reenact it. They're doing songs. There's this whole project of creating masks of how people actually felt. So, I mean, these things can be like, literature, poetry, these things can be like resources that if kind of done together, I mean, maybe even can be done with people who are coming and seeking help in these humanitarian places. That's not my expertise. And I know that seems very possibly soft and squishy, but if like a briefing and then setting up some like practices and some ways to move forward so that so you're constantly tapping into that space might be very helpful and might be,
I just have one thing to add to that real quick before we move on. But I think that like something that everyone kind of touched upon in their discussion here, and how like obviously like to the length of the discussion for just a few questions, this is a really ambiguous topic still. Like it's a fluid definition, and because the very concepts that we use to make up defining moral injury are so individualized and so fluid and context specific, I think those types of exercises are really valuable, because it's like when it comes to describing these types of morally injurious events, it's layers and layers and layers of like, why does this make me feel this way? How does it make me feel? How does it relate to everything that's going on around me? Like that mask thing, that's really cool. And I was sitting here thinking about it too. I'm like, yeah, all of the times that I experienced something that really did damage my morality, that artistic expression was the go-to way that I sorted out, because it's that like, that itch you can't scratch feeling where you're like something about this isn't sitting right with me and I don't know why. Like, I can't go straight to my therapist and say, like, on this day, this happened and this is how it made me feel, which, like, trauma work, I feel like modern day trauma work is changing a bit, but at least traditional trauma work was a bit more in that line of, like, what specific injury, like, was it an adverse childhood event? Was it a life, like, adult trauma? What happened that triggered this cascade of feelings and emotions? And with moral injury, I think it's a bit harder for us because it's about, yes, the incident, but also how it relates to our wider existence, and that makes it hard for us to articulate. So I think, yeah, I would agree. Maybe it seems a little soft, but I think that that's definitely the way. If people are looking for something to take away from it, that's really good advice.
Personally, I wouldn't even describe it as soft. I think we're long past the time where art therapy and music therapy and so on were considered invalid forms of treatment or support. I think they're widely considered, very effective. So I think it's a really good thing to add to the arsenal, really. Adrian, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just want to say first that I couldn't agree more with Joe and Madi about just our communication about what moral injury is and what it looks like. Something I will say that military has many faults, but with particularly moral injury, they are aware of it. They are concerned with it. They are putting it in the primary lens of what they're really needing to do. So much so that I've met with people from the Air Force, people from the Army, like higher ups asking, like, what can we do about it? We know it's coming. We know it's a real thing. And I think one of the key things that is particularly for that sector that I think can definitely be applied to the humanitarian sector is a lot of these people who are working in that were experienced it, war veterans, are the top researchers in this domain have experienced it and understand it. For us to do it in the humanitarian sector, we need people like you and Madi and others to really focus on it, bring it up to the vocabulary and so forth. But we also need those individuals who are suffering as well to be part of that conversation. How would they define moral injury? I can't even imagine how they would view it, particularly in how their sense of what it looks like. Is it another term? I think a lot of times we come up with these terms and say, oh, it's this. I'm like, yeah, we've been calling it this for a long time. Like there's so many different ways that people can categorize or even say it. And I think vocabulary matters a lot. How do I moral injury in Spanish? And I'm fluent in Spanish. I can't even think of the right way to say that. And so having those people who are dealing with those things or those migrants, being involved in that conversation, not only from a sense of how we can, as researchers or professionals, understand it, but more so, well, how can they give back to that community as well? Because I think a lot of times, particularly for these migrants or refugees, yes, they appreciate the people helping them, those frontline workers, those aides and so forth, but there's always a level of not distrust, but not full commitment of trust, mainly because you're not experiencing what I'm experiencing. So I'm really glad you're helping me, but no one can understand what I'm going through. And I think a lot to help overcome this from a prevention standpoint, or at least tackling some of these issues, is having stakeholders who are intimately involved with those individuals. Whether in some of the research we do, we particularly with Latino families who have recently immigrated, one of the things we want to do is highlight some important community member who can bring up mental health issues, talk about these very sensitive issues, but someone from within their own community. So could we identify leaders within those, even these very adverse conditions? Typically, individuals will look to each other for support. Who is the one who they're looking to? That's the individual we need to be targeting to be able to talk about this more, to illuminate it to the people that they truly trust in many ways. And in many cultures, a lot of these people are more impactful to them than any other people, politicians or whatnot. And so these community leaders will be part of that. And so in tackling any big construct like this, I think you can focus on prevention or intervention. The prevention side, we need more, as Madi and Daniel, you well know, about policy, different things to avoid as much of these experiences as possible. I don't think we'll ever get to a point where there won't be any. So that's why you still need the intervention side of it. But there's a lot that we need to do to be able to at least make it so it's not so consistent, so not traumatic in that way. From the intervention side, I think what Joe mentioned about various things, both from a community standpoint and an individual standpoint, I couldn't agree more about the community standpoint from it. I think people highlighting the fact that this is a real thing, being acknowledging of it and trying to recognize that these things are occurring is quite important. And with regards to intervening, I agree with Joe. I think there's not one, I don't think and this is just me for all psychology, there's not one treatment that works for everyone. And that's just not going to be possible in any way. But what can we start understanding and tailoring our interventions to what might be feasible for these individuals? And so our work is really focused on mindfulness, And particularly more so, not because it's helpful for those individuals who are suffering with those moral emotions, guilt, shame, and so forth, to be able to be in the moment and present, not suppress those feelings, understand that they're having these concerns and issues. But the nice part about mindfulness particularly is anyone can do it and you can do it anywhere. And so that's just one approach. But I think a lot of it that we can't ignore either is our chaplains, our others. So this is, for many of them, religious or spiritual kind of conflicts. And psychologists can't fix that for them in no matter what. So I think we needed integration of multiple sectors of professionals that could tackle this issue, and particularly in the humanitarian world, particularly because the resources there, as you both well know, is just lacking in so many other domains. And I think what happens is, well, I just need to eat. These other higher priorities, which are very important, obviously shelter, all these things are really needed, but that to what cost is that we're diminishing all these interpersonal issues that these individuals are truly struggling with. And the more focus and lens to that, yes, we need all those things, but we can't ignore their well-being either. It's just as important.
And I want to touch on that real quick as well, because so the webinar that we did earlier this month in celebration of Mental Health Awareness Month really talked about, you know, gender as it relates to mental health problems. Because at least here where I work in the MENA region, like right now, I live in Turkey. And so in Istanbul, we have a very diverse migrant population, and I work predominantly with men. And so, you know, even just the discussion of mental health problems with them, like asking, do you have any mental health problems? That is the absolute wrong way to have this discussion and this conversation. And so what's great about the moral injury lens is that it's a way that you can sort of say, you know, have you ever experienced a time where you felt like you had to violate what was right and wrong? And that, you know, that's the kind of thing that sort of translates over a little better. I think what's cool about this discussion is maybe the actual term moral injury doesn't translate over well, but the concept of it, I think, is something that all of us can grasp very easily. Whereas trauma work, trauma care, traumatic experiences, even the physiological manifestations of trauma and the path, like what the changes it causes to your neural pathways, that's still not culturally accepted in a lot of the cultures and countries of the people that we're working with in the humanitarian sector a lot of times. And so it's given us that way to sort of ask people these questions and to understand a little bit better, you know, how is this making them feel? What's their experience with this? And Adrian mentioned something important too, you know, are they already familiar with this and they're just calling it something different? I think it allows for a different type of conversation, which is really important for us to be having.
Absolutely. And that's something that I'm really glad that you've both touched upon there is this kind of, I guess, the importance of communication across cultures here, because I was worried that this was going to be a bit of a roadblock, because Adrian, I think you mentioned it first, the problem of translating it across different cultures. And of course, that is a real problem with mental health in general, is discussing it with people, because every culture and indeed every person has a very different perception of it, or a very different idea of what it is, whether it even exists, and how it can be treated if it does exist. And I think that will be even more the case with moral injury, because it's a concept that, as you were saying, Joe, we're still really working on the language of it, really. So I'm really glad that you've talked about these ways of trying to communicate across culture, because you've also all said how the most important thing is, in terms of support, is community support. And of course, that's very difficult if communities can't even talk about it. So yeah, I'm really glad that you've touched on that. I'm conscious that we're now coming up to an hour, and I don't want to keep anyone here too late, but does anyone have any final thoughts on the subject? On anything that we've said here today?
No, the only thing I would like to add is thank you for the work they are doing. I think having these type of webinars, having these kind of exposures really is the first step. I mean, because like Joe has mentioned, a lot of people don't even recognize that they're struggling with these issues and so forth. And I think illuminating what is going on is important, and highlighting that this is not something that just can be pushed away or brushed aside, because this is something that's truly causing distress, whether that's spiritual distress, moral distress, whatever it may be. And so it's impactful in some way, and typically in a negative way. And the question becomes, well, what can we do about it? Not only for each individual, but more holistically and more globally, like how do we tackle this issue? And it's something that's not going to go away. And unfortunately, given the times, particularly with COVID-19, while financially, I would say it causes a lot of issues, I would say it's really what has happened. It's magnified existing issues and existing injustices or particularly systematic issues or institutions have done things wrong, and we just brushed it off or never got the time to realize how poorly it's been done. And now it's, with COVID-19, we can't ignore it anymore. And so particularly within the humanitarian sector and all this is going on, it's one of the few things this pandemic has happened that it's a global issue for once, and something that we all have to understand. And hopefully this eliminates, well, these humanitarian crises are not just something that happens in a faraway place. These impact many people. And even if you might not feel it directly, it does not mean that it's not something that is not needed to be emphasized or magnified, and how we can treat it and deal with it and create a much better world for those individuals.
Yeah, I coming from originally in kind of religion, conflict, and peace studies, one of the reasons why, one of the ways I would communicate the importance of things like moral injury was to say, like, well, you know, if you're doing things like transitional justice, humanitarian interventions, you know, you're not going to fully address the issues there unless you're also looking at this dimension, right? I mean, we even see this in the pandemic language in the United States now, and I think it's also in other countries of like, you know, we're falling behind. We have to make sure that we're whatever falling behind is, and it's always spoken of in terms of economics, education, right? But never in terms of, well, what's happened to people? How have they transformed? How do they see the world differently, right? And I think that the only way that you can do this, and you know, Adrian, you said this about in something, nobody really owns the moral, and it's something that requires, since it's human, it requires a lot of different perspectives. And I think I'm really grateful for this, and I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing, because this bridging this divide between academia and practitioners goes straight to my heart. I went into academia because I'd been in the nonprofit world and just realized that people just they were looking for ideas. They were looking for ways to frame things, to understand things, right? And I don't think the problem is that there's theory and practice. I think it's just that our institutions have sadly divided that. So I'm very grateful for this work, because I think that there's so much more that can be done if we kind of allowed ourselves to have these dialogues, be challenged, and also just allow ourselves to help each other.
That made me think, I guess, like one of the last points I want to make is that a lot of people too, like, you know, okay, so we normalize this term, moral injury, we become familiar with it. And something that I've already started to see, especially again with the current narrative in the United States, you know, people sort of saying, you know, what's my role in these social injustices that we're dissecting here? As healthcare workers, it's one I know intimately, where all of us are kind of like, what role are we playing here in perpetuating this medical industry that's making people sicker? Like, if you take a second to step back and look at it, you quickly realize you're a part of this problem. And now, you know, decolonization is really becoming a part of the mainstream discussion too, which is great. But one of my fears, because it's something I've already seen a bit, is people, you know, they recognize where their morality has been injured somewhere further upstream, and then they might start projecting like saviorism onto other populations, vulnerable populations, as a way to kind of like overcompensate and repair, because that reconciliation with the role that they or their ancestors play in this system that causes injustice, a lot of times, of course, our inclination is to then like swing to the other extreme and be like, how can I fix this? And the humanitarian sector, that is the humanitarian sector. Plain and simple. That is the humanitarian sector. Unfortunately, it's dominated by this concept of saviorism, and with nonprofits, at least, it's just evolved out of control into another industrial complex that's basically like the same problem, just in a different suit. And so I definitely don't want to discourage people from diving into this type of exploration, but it's similar to trauma work. Like, you need that supportive network there. Everyone touched on the importance of community. Like, you do need, this isn't something that you should necessarily just dive head on into and then immediately say like, okay, well, these are all the times that I made a decision that wasn't in line with my morality, and that makes me feel guilt, shame, and it turns you totally irrational. And then you go and start projecting your guilt and shame onto other people. That's the only thing in this whole conversation where I'm like, yeah, yikes, that scares me a bit about this. That scares me about bringing this vocabulary and this concept into the mainstream world, is I don't know how ready we are to handle it. Similar to trauma work, right? And so that's kind of the last closing thought I have on that. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that, or if you've experienced that or witnessed it.
Yeah, no, I can't agree more. And I think this is why now is the time to do this work, because like, while yes, the term has been around for a while, really, and Joe can attest to this, it's been like what, last 20, 25 years where the empirical work has started to come out of this. And so instead of 50 years later, like, oh, we put a shot, should have done this. Why not start now to get the input from those individuals who are truly impacted now? Get them involved, get them, because I agree, particularly, I'll never forget, I was talking to a young lady about like Latinos and the migrant work and all that. And she was trying to tell me how Latinos should do it and how to do it. I'm like, I'm sorry, you're not even me. Like, why are you telling me how I should do it? So I think there is this whole swing. And particularly we're talking about something that's unique to each individual. How do we know what's the right approach for them to how to deal with it? And so this is why I encourage that it has to be holistic. It has to be taken by a multitude of different stakeholders, a lot of alternative ways for them to deal with it. If they're truly religious, then you can't just ignore the religious side of it, because they need that to be repaired in some way. You can't just go secular and tell them like, this is the right intervention. And the same way in the other side as well. And so I think because it's so early on now that it's becoming more mainstream, the question is, well, we just can't have this ivory tower kind of effect where it's a few of us at the top who do the work and say, well, this is how it should be for all of you. I'm like, we don't even know what they're dealing with. I think we need to ask them as well and have them involved for this to be an effective work, for us to effectively treat it and deal with it.
This is such a hard question. I mean, we're working with engineering students. I'm working with one professor who's just so exasperated that she can't get the students not to think that they're the experts bringing the solutions, right? To the point where we have, calling them stakeholders, getting very exasperated with the students, not looking at them as holding the issues, right? This is something I'm working with a friend and a colleague. We're looking at moral injury and race and whiteness, and it's really, really difficult because it can be turned around so quickly to being like, it's almost like a defense mechanism, right? It goes to this thing of like, we can go a whole conversation with this, right? But and I think there are models out there, like there's some work being done in like the mid-Atlantic states, United States. This church, a minister and a doctor have come together, and they're training just regular people how to listen to veterans, and just to kind of have these meetings, and where the practice is how to listen. What do they need? What are they saying, right? And I think that's what it is. It's a practice. I think especially in a country in the United States where whiteness is huge, where white supremacy is huge, that's something that I'm a large white guy. I kind of embody this when I walk into a room. But it has to be a practice, right? So I think along with this moral injury, if we think of moral injury as a part of moral development of people growing, we can kind of broaden that out and say, and kind of what Adrian, what you're saying with prevention, people need to be doing practices long before they enter situations like this so that they can do this. I mean, it's incredibly hard, it involves a lot, but I think a lot of it is trying to reimagine, say like professions like humanitarianism or healthcare as not just services or technical work, even as vocations, but as places where do we develop as human beings. And so where do we need? So I think like bringing practices into that and making them more central. I know that's big and that's a lot. But it also, I think, goes to the fact that the question you raise is such an important and such a big one.
Well, absolutely. And you've all raised at one point or another throughout this session that some of these questions could almost merit their own discussion and their own webinar again. And actually, I'd love to return to this. This has been such an interesting discussion, and I'd love to return to some of these kind of sub-questions that we've raised, but maybe not had time to tackle in their fullest. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. It's been really fascinating discussion, really good to have the benefit of your expertise. So thank you very much for volunteering your time to be with us today. And we'll be uploading this to YouTube later this evening, if anyone would like to catch the discussion again. And please do follow us on social media if you'd like to kind of be kept up to date on our future webinars. We normally have 2 a month. So yeah, we'd love to see you again soon.
I would love to have another conversation similar to this, you guys. I really feel when we are writing out the questions, I'm just like, off of each one, I felt like we could pick like a whole tangent, and I'm like, we got to keep it simple. We got to keep it simple. But I think, you know, this one could be sort of the preface of lots of other discussions. And we can say, hey, if you want to tune into this one, just watch this last webinar first to sort of get your bearings. And then I think we really could dive into a lot of these topics, especially as you guys all brought up, we're kind of at a pivotal point, not just with moral injury as a concept, but how it relates to the transitional justice movements and things that we're experiencing right now, you know?
Yeah, that'd be terrific.
It would be really cool.
Great.
Yeah, so please keep in touch. Thank you all so much for your time today. And Daniel, thank you for your amazing moderating and questioning. This was amazing. Thank you all.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much. See you soon.
Yep.
Bye.
Take care.